Orphan boy sends a letter to Santa. What arrives at the orphanage leaves him in awe. The snow fell softly over the quiet town, blanketing the rooftops and streets in a thick, pristine layer. Inside the small, drafty orphanage on the edge of town, 12-year-old Oliver sat on a wooden bench by the frosted window, his fingers numb from the cold as he clutched a piece of paper. It was Christmas Eve, and while most children were excitedly decorating trees or unwrapping gifts, the mood at the orphanage was subdued. There were no stockings hung by the fireplace, no glittering tree to gather around, and certainly no presents waiting to be unwrapped. For the orphans, Christmas was just another day, maybe a slightly warmer meal, but no more. But Oliver, with his untamed mop of brown hair and wide, curious eyes, refused to give in to despair. He had an idea, a wild, improbable idea, that had been forming in his mind for weeks. Tonight he would act on it. Oliver carefully smoothed out the crumpled sheet of paper and began writing, his handwriting shaky but determined. "Dear Santa," he began, the words heavy with hope. "My name is Oliver, and I live at the St. Mary's Orphanage. I know you're busy, and I don't want to ask for much, but if you can, I have a wish. It's not for toys or candy. I just want to know what it feels like to be part of a family. Thank you, Santa. Merry Christmas." He hesitated for a moment, then signed his name with a flourish. He folded the letter carefully, slipping it into an envelope he had scavenged from the orphanage's office, and addressed it simply, "Santa Claus, North Pole." The other children at the orphanage teased him when they saw him with the letter. "Santa doesn't read letters from orphans," sneered Peter, the self-appointed leader of the boys. "He only cares about rich kids with chimneys and fancy cookies." Oliver ignored them, clutching the envelope tightly. He had heard the same taunts every year, but he refused to let their cynicism dampen his spirit. That evening, after dinner, he slipped out into the freezing night, his thin coat barely enough to keep the chill at bay. He trudged through the snow to the old red mailbox at the corner of the street. The stars above twinkled like diamonds, and for a moment, Oliver allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Santa was listening. With a deep breath, he slid the letter into the mailbox and whispered, "Please let this work." Then he turned and ran back to the orphanage, the cold biting at his cheeks. Christmas morning dawned with the faint glow of winter sunlight. The children at the orphanage woke to their usual routine, a meager breakfast and chores. There were no gifts waiting for them, no stockings filled with surprises. Oliver tried to keep his spirits up, but as the day wore on, doubt began to creep in. Maybe Peter was right. Maybe Santa didn't read letters from boys like him. Still, he clung to a fragile thread of hope. It was mid-afternoon when the sound of crunching snow outside the orphanage caught everyone's attention. The children crowded around the window, their breath fogging up the glass as they tried to see what was happening. A large delivery truck had pulled up in front of the orphanage, and two men in heavy coats were unloading boxes. The matron, Mrs. Hargrove, rushed out to meet them, her face a mix of confusion and curiosity. "What's going on?" Peter asked, craning his neck to see. "I don't know," Oliver said, his heart pounding. He had a strange feeling, like the moment before a surprise, when the world holds its breath. The men carried the boxes inside, stacking them in the main hall. Mrs. Hargrove inspected the first box, her eyebrows shooting up in astonishment. "It's gifts," she said, her voice trembling. "For all of you." The children gasped, their eyes wide with disbelief. "Gifts? At the orphanage?" Mrs. Hargrove read the label on the box aloud. "From the desk of Santa Claus." Oliver's heart skipped a beat. He stepped forward hesitantly as the children buzzed with excitement. Could it be? Inside the boxes were toys, books, warm clothes, and treats, enough for every child at the orphanage. There was laughter and joy as the children tore into the gifts, their usual reserve replaced with pure delight. Even Peter, who always prided himself on being too tough for such things, couldn't hide his smile as he unwrapped a brand new soccer ball. Amid the chaos, Mrs. Hargrove approached Oliver, holding a smaller box with his name on it. "This one's for you, dear," she said, her voice gentle. Oliver took the box with trembling hands and opened it slowly. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal, a set of colored pencils, and a letter. He unfolded the letter, his heart racing as he read the words. "Dear Oliver," it began. "Thank you for your letter. Your wish touched my heart. I hope these gifts bring you and your friends joy this Christmas. And as for your wish, sometimes, family isn't about where you come from but who you choose to share your life with. Keep believing, Oliver. Merry Christmas. Santa Claus." Tears welled up in Oliver's eyes as he read the letter. It wasn't just the gifts, it was the feeling that someone, somewhere, had listened and cared. The rest of the day was filled with laughter and warmth. For the first time in years, the orphanage felt like a home. The children played with their new toys, shared their treats, and reveled in the unexpected magic of the day. That night, as Oliver sat on his bed with the journal in his lap, he thought about Santa's words. Family isn't about where you come from, but who you choose to share your life with. Looking around at the other children, Peter trying to teach the younger kids to dribble a soccer ball, Sally carefully braiding the hair of a doll she'd named Bella, Oliver realized that, in a way, he already had a family. It might not look like the ones in the stories, but it was his. And for the first time in his life, Oliver truly believed in the magic of Christmas. The magic of Christmas lingered in the air long after the day ended. For the children at St. Mary's Orphanage, that year's Christmas was more than just a collection of gifts. It was a moment that reminded them they were not forgotten. They were seen. They mattered. But for Oliver, the letter from Santa meant more than anything else. He carried the folded piece of paper in his pocket everywhere he went, occasionally pulling it out to read the words again. Each time he did, it filled him with a sense of hope and wonder. As winter turned to spring, the mood in the orphanage shifted. The children, who had always been wary of showing too much enthusiasm about anything, began to let their guard down. They laughed more. They dreamed more. Even Peter, who had been the first to mock Oliver's letter, seemed softer. "Hey, Oliver," Peter said one afternoon as they kicked a soccer ball around the yard. "You know, I didn't think that letter thing would work. I figured you were just being dumb." Oliver grinned, ducking as the ball flew past him. "And now?" Peter hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe there is something out there, someone out there, watching out for us." The words were clumsy, but they meant everything to Oliver. "Maybe there is," he said quietly. One afternoon in early April, as the children returned from school, Mrs. Hargrove greeted them with an announcement. "Children, we'll have a visitor tomorrow. Someone very important who wants to see all of you." "Who is it?" Sally asked, clutching her doll Bella. Mrs. Hargrove smiled mysteriously. "You'll see. But I expect all of you to be on your best behavior." The children spent the evening speculating. Was it someone from the town council? A government official? Maybe someone who had read about the Christmas miracle and wanted to help the orphanage? Oliver, however, had a feeling. A strange, unshakable feeling that whoever it was, it had something to do with the letter he had sent months ago. The next day, the children lined up neatly in the main hall, their hair combed and their clothes as tidy as possible. The anticipation was palpable as they waited for the visitor to arrive. At precisely 2 p.m., the door creaked open, and a tall man in a navy blue coat stepped inside. He was accompanied by a woman in a cream-colored dress and a warm scarf. Both of them had kind eyes and gentle smiles. "Hello," the man said, his voice rich and soothing. "You must be the children of St. Mary's." Mrs. Hargrove stepped forward, extending her hand. "Welcome, Mr. and Mrs. Carter. It's an honor to have you here." Oliver's heart raced. He had never heard of the Carters before, but there was something familiar about them. He couldn't quite place it, but it felt like the moment before you remember a dream. Mr. and Mrs. Carter introduced themselves to the children, taking the time to speak to each one. When they reached Oliver, the man knelt down to his level, his smile warm. "You must be Oliver," Mr. Carter said. Oliver blinked. "How do you know my name?" Mrs. Carter smiled softly, kneeling beside her husband. "We read a letter, Oliver. A very special letter written by a very brave boy." Oliver's breath hitched. "You saw my letter to Santa?" The Carters nodded. "We did," Mr. Carter said. "And we wanted to meet the boy who wrote it." "But how?" Oliver asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Carter reached out and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, letters find their way to the right people, Oliver. And sometimes, the best way to grant a wish is to show up in person. Over the next few hours, the Carters spoke with Mrs. Hargrove and spent time with the children, learning about their lives and dreams. Oliver stayed close, his heart a whirlwind of emotions. He didn't understand exactly what was happening, but he knew this moment was important. As the day turned to evening, the Carters gathered the children in the main hall. Mr. Carter cleared his throat, his expression both serious and kind. "We've been searching for a way to help children like you," he began. "To give you the love and care every child deserves. And after hearing about this orphanage and the wonderful children here, we've made a decision." Mrs. Carter continued, her voice steady. "We want to sponsor this orphanage. We'll provide the resources you need, better meals, new clothes, books, toys, and most importantly, opportunities. We'll make sure each of you has the chance to grow and thrive." The room erupted into cheers and applause. Even Peter, who rarely showed excitement, was grinning from ear to ear. But Oliver's joy was tinged with disbelief. "Why?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why would you do all this for us?" Mrs. Carter knelt down again, meeting his eyes. "Because we believe in you, Oliver. Your letter reminded us of what truly matters: family, love, and hope. And if we can be part of making those things a reality for you and your friends, then we're honored to do so." The weeks that followed were transformative. The Carters stayed true to their word, pouring resources and attention into the orphanage. The children received new clothes and school supplies, the meals became hearty and delicious, and the once crumbling building was repaired and repainted. For the first time in years, the orphanage felt alive. But for Oliver, the greatest gift wasn't the material changes, it was the bond he formed with the Carters. They visited often, bringing warmth and joy with them every time. And with each visit, Oliver felt a little more like he belonged. One sunny afternoon in late spring, the Carters took Oliver aside. "We've been thinking a lot about family," Mr. Carter said, his tone serious. "And we were wondering, would you like to be part of ours?" Oliver stared at them, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You mean, you want to adopt me?" Mrs. Carter nodded, her smile soft. "Only if you want to, Oliver. There's no pressure. But we'd be honored to call you our son." Tears streamed down Oliver's face as he nodded furiously. "Yes," he whispered. "I'd love that." That Christmas, Oliver sat by the fireplace in the Carters' cozy home, surrounded by warmth, love, and the family he had always dreamed of. In his lap was the journal he had received the previous year, now filled with colorful sketches and stories. On the mantel above the fireplace, his original letter to Santa was framed, a reminder of the magic that had changed his life. And as he looked around the room, at the Carters, at the joy and love that filled every corner, Oliver knew he had received the greatest gift of all. He had found his family. After dinner, the Carters handed out gifts. Oliver sat on the floor, his eyes wide as he unwrapped a box containing a model train set. His hands trembled as he traced the intricate details of the train, and his face lit up with pure joy. "Do you like it?" Mr. Carter asked, kneeling beside him. Oliver nodded vigorously. "I love it. Thank you." Mrs. Carter smiled from the couch. "We thought you might enjoy building it. Something tells me you're good with your hands." Oliver looked up at her, his heart swelling. He had never received such a thoughtful gift before. It wasn't just the train, it was the understanding behind it, the way the Carters saw him for who he was and encouraged his interests. As the night wore on, the Carters brought out a special surprise. A stocking embroidered with Oliver's name. It was hung by the fireplace alongside their own, filled to the brim with treats and small gifts. Seeing his name stitched so carefully brought tears to Oliver's eyes. "You're part of this family now," Mrs. Carter said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "And that means you get your own stocking, just like the rest of us." Oliver nodded, unable to find the words to express his gratitude. All he could do was hug her tightly, his small frame trembling with emotion. The days that followed were filled with moments that solidified Oliver's place in the Carter family. Mr. Carter took him to a hobby store to pick out more model kits, while Mrs. Carter encouraged him to use his journal to write stories and draw. They spent weekends exploring museums, parks, and libraries, nurturing his curiosity and creativity. But perhaps the most meaningful moments were the quiet ones, the bedtime stories, the shared laughter during meals, and the simple but powerful act of hearing "Goodnight, Oliver" as they tucked him in each evening. Meanwhile, the changes at St. Mary's Orphanage continued to unfold. The Carter sponsorship had not only transformed the building but also the lives of the children who still lived there. The new resources meant better education, more activities, and brighter futures for everyone. Oliver visited often, bringing stories of his life with the Carters and sharing them with his old friends. Peter, once skeptical of Oliver's optimism, had softened considerably. He pulled Oliver aside one afternoon during a visit. "You know," Peter began, his voice hesitant, "I didn't think any of this was possible. Thought we were just stuck. But you proved me wrong." Oliver smiled. "I didn't do it alone." Peter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Still, you didn't give up. That's what matters." One spring morning, during a family breakfast, Mr. Carter set down his coffee cup and looked at Oliver with a twinkle in his eye. "Oliver, there's something we've been thinking about. It's up to you, of course, but we'd like to make it official." Oliver tilted his head, confused. "Make what official?" Mrs. Carter reached for his hand. "We'd like to adopt you. Legally, we mean. You're already our son in every way that matters, but we want it to be official on paper." Oliver's heart skipped a beat. "You mean I'd really be your son? Forever?" "Forever," Mr. Carter said firmly. Tears streamed down Oliver's face as he nodded. "Yes, I'd love that." The adoption process was a whirlwind of paperwork and meetings, but the Carters were steadfast in their determination to make Oliver an official part of their family. When the day of the adoption hearing arrived, Oliver sat nervously in the courthouse, clutching Mrs. Carter's hand. The judge, a kind-looking woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose, smiled warmly at Oliver. "Oliver, do you understand what this means? That the Carters will be your parents from now on?" "Yes, ma'am," Oliver said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "I want that more than anything." The judge nodded, her smile widening. "Then it's my pleasure to grant the adoption. Congratulations, Oliver. You're officially a Carter now." The room erupted into applause as Oliver leaped into the Carters' arms, his laughter mingling with their tears of joy. That evening, back at home, the Carters celebrated with a special dinner. Afterward, they surprised Oliver with a small, beautifully wrapped box. Inside was a silver locket with the word "family" engraved on the front. Inside the locket were two tiny photos, one of Mr. and Mrs. Carter, and one of Oliver. "This is to remind you," Mrs. Carter said, her voice thick with emotion, "that no matter what, you'll always have a family." Oliver held the locket tightly, his chest swelling with love and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." As the years went by, Oliver flourished under the Carters' care. He excelled in school, his natural curiosity and creativity shining in every subject. He continued to visit St. Mary's, often bringing supplies and gifts to the children who still lived there. But his favorite time of year was always Christmas. Each year, he hung his special stocking by the fireplace and wrote a new letter to Santa, not to ask for anything but to thank him. One Christmas Eve, as he sat by the fire with the Carters, Oliver reflected on how far he had come. He was no longer the lonely boy staring out the orphanage window, wondering if anyone cared. He had a home, a family, and a future filled with possibility. And though he couldn't explain how his letter had found its way to the Carters, he believed in the magic of that moment more than ever. Because sometimes the greatest gifts aren't wrapped in paper and bows. Sometimes, they're the people who remind us that we're never truly alone. The years passed like pages turning in a storybook, and Oliver grew into a bright, compassionate young man. The Carters nurtured his love for learning, encouraging his dreams while giving him the tools to make them a reality. He excelled in school, often earning top marks, and his talent for drawing and storytelling blossomed into a passion he couldn't ignore. By the time Oliver was 16, he had filled countless journals with sketches and stories, many of them inspired by his life at the orphanage and the transformative Christmas that had changed everything. But one story stood out among the rest, the tale of a boy who sent a letter to Santa and discovered the true meaning of family. It was a story Oliver knew he wanted to share with the world. One snowy afternoon during the holiday season, Oliver sat in the cozy Carter living room, flipping through his old journals. Mrs. Carter entered, carrying a tray of hot cocoa and cookies. "Working on something special?" she asked, setting the tray down on the coffee table. Oliver looked up, a shy smile on his face. "I think I want to write a book." Mrs. Carter's eyes lit up. "That's wonderful, Oliver. What's it about?" "It's about us," he said softly. "About the letter I sent to Santa, the gifts that came to the orphanage, and how you and Mr. Carter found me. I want people to know that hope and kindness can change lives." Mrs. Carter's expression softened, her eyes misty. "That's a beautiful idea, sweetheart. I think the world needs a story like that." With the Carters' encouragement, Oliver poured his heart into the book. He wrote late into the night, recounting every detail of his journey: the cold winters at the orphanage, the teasing from the other children, the moment he sent the letter, and the miraculous arrival of the Carters. He wrote about the gifts, the love, and the new beginnings that followed. Through his words, he relived the emotions of those pivotal moments, turning his memories into something tangible. By the time he finished the manuscript, he was both nervous and exhilarated. "Do you think anyone will want to read it?" he asked the Carters as they sat around the dinner table one evening. "I don't think," Mr. Carter said with a confident smile. "I know. It's a story the world will cherish." The Carters helped Oliver submit the manuscript to publishers, and within months, he received the news he had been dreaming of. A publisher wanted to turn his story into a book. The day the contract arrived, Oliver could hardly believe his eyes. "This is really happening," he whispered, holding the papers in his trembling hands. Mrs. Carter hugged him tightly. "Yes, it is. And you deserve every bit of it." The book, titled A Letter to Santa, A Story of Hope and Family, was published the following year, just in time for Christmas. It quickly became a bestseller, touching the hearts of readers young and old. Critics praised its honesty and warmth, while readers wrote letters to Oliver, sharing how his story had inspired them. At the book's launch event, Oliver stood on a small stage in a bustling bookstore, nervously gripping a copy of his book. The room was filled with people, some familiar, like the Carters and children from St. Mary's, and others he had never met but who had been moved by his story. "Thank you all for being here," Oliver began, his voice shaky but steadying as he spoke. "This book isn't just my story. It's about the power of hope, kindness, and the belief that we're never truly alone. I hope it reminds everyone that even in the darkest moments, there's always a chance for light." The crowd erupted into applause, and Oliver felt a wave of pride and gratitude wash over him. This wasn't just his success, it was a testament to the love and support that had carried him to this moment. As the years went by, Oliver's book became a beloved holiday classic, and he continued to write stories that celebrated resilience, love, and the magic of human connection. He visited schools, orphanages, and community centers, sharing his journey and encouraging others to hold on to hope. St. Mary's Orphanage thrived under the Carter sponsorship, and many of the children who had lived there went on to build happy, successful lives. Oliver stayed connected to the orphanage, visiting often and mentoring the younger children. One Christmas Eve, now in his 20s, Oliver found himself back at the Carter home, sitting by the same fireplace where he had first hung his special stocking. The locket the Carters had given him all those years ago still rested around his neck, a constant reminder of the love that had changed his life. As he watched the firelight dance across the room, Mrs. Carter joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Thinking about something?" Oliver smiled. "Just remembering. Everything. How far we've come." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "It's been a beautiful journey, hasn't it?" "It has," he agreed. "And I wouldn't change a thing." Later that night, as snow gently fell outside, Oliver sat down to write his annual letter to Santa. Though he no longer sent them, the tradition had become a way for him to reflect on the year and express his gratitude. "Dear Santa," he wrote, "thank you for the Carters, for the love they've given me, and for the chance to share my story with the world. Thank you for reminding me that hope is never wasted. Merry Christmas." He folded the letter and placed it in his journal, where it would join the others he had written over the years. And as he climbed into bed, the locket resting against his chest, Oliver knew he had already received the greatest gift of all: a family who loved him, a story worth sharing, and a life filled with purpose and joy. The boy who once sent a letter to Santa had grown into a man who understood that magic wasn't just in the gifts or the miracles. It was in the people who showed up, believed in him, and reminded him that he mattered. And for that, he would always be grateful. As the years continued to pass, Oliver's life unfolded like a beautifully written story, filled with milestones, moments of reflection, and opportunities to give back. His journey from an orphan to a celebrated author and advocate for hope and resilience became a source of inspiration for countless people. In his late 20s, Oliver's name became synonymous with stories that touched hearts and changed lives. He had written several books by then, each one exploring themes of love, family, and the power of kindness. But it was his debut book, A Letter to Santa, a story of hope and family, that remained closest to his heart. One day, while visiting a school to speak to children about the importance of holding on to hope, a young girl raised her hand. "Mr. Carter," she said timidly, "how did you keep believing in Santa when people said he wasn't real?" Oliver smiled warmly, kneeling down to meet her gaze. "That's a great question. I think Santa isn't just about the person we imagine in the red suit. Santa is about the magic of hope. The idea that there's someone out there who cares, who listens, and who can make things better. For me, believing in Santa meant believing that good things can happen, even when it feels impossible." The girl nodded, her eyes wide with understanding. "So, Santa is like believing in something bigger than ourselves?" "Exactly," Oliver said, his heart swelling with pride. "And that kind of belief can take us to amazing places." As Oliver's work continued to grow, so did his impact. He established the Letter to Hope Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting children in need, especially those in foster care and orphanages. The foundation provided resources, mentorship programs, and creative outlets for children to express themselves through art and writing. The foundation's flagship initiative, inspired by Oliver's own story, encouraged children to write letters to Santa, letters to their future selves, or even letters to people they admired. The act of writing became a way for them to articulate their dreams and take the first steps toward achieving them. One Christmas, the foundation organized a massive event at St. Mary's Orphanage, which had been transformed into a beacon of hope under the Carters' sponsorship. Children from all over the region were invited to participate, and the event included storytelling, games, and the unveiling of a new library built on the orphanage grounds. As Oliver stood before the crowd, surrounded by children eagerly clutching their letters, he felt a surge of emotion. He thought back to the cold winter night when he had slipped his own letter into the mailbox, never imagining the journey it would set in motion. "Today," he began, his voice steady, "we celebrate the power of words. A single letter can change a life. It changed mine. And my wish for each of you is that you never stop believing in the magic of your dreams." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Oliver felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He had come full circle, returning to the place where his story had begun, now with the ability to give back in ways he had once only dreamed of. But life had more surprises in store for Oliver. At one of his book signings, a woman approached him, her face familiar in a way he couldn't quite place. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I've wanted to meet you for so long. My name is Anna, and I used to work at the postal service in town." Oliver blinked, startled. "You worked at the post office?" She nodded. "I was the one who found your letter to Santa all those years ago. When I read it, I couldn't ignore it. I didn't know what to do at first, but then I remembered the Carters. They had come in months before, asking about ways to help children in need. I thought your letter might be what they were looking for." Oliver's heart raced as he processed her words. "You gave my letter to the Carters?" "I did," Anna said, tears streaming down her face. "And I've followed your story ever since. Seeing what you've done, how you've turned that moment into something so beautiful, it's been the greatest joy of my life." Overwhelmed, Oliver reached out and hugged her. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You changed my life. I can't ever thank you enough." Anna smiled through her tears. "You've already done more than I could have imagined." That Christmas, Oliver invited Anna to the Carters' home for their annual celebration. Sitting by the fire, surrounded by his family and the woman who had unknowingly set everything into motion, Oliver felt a profound sense of gratitude. As they exchanged stories and laughter, Oliver realized that his journey wasn't just about one letter, one wish, or even one family. It was about the countless people who had played a part, however small, in creating something extraordinary. Years later, Oliver's story would become the subject of a film, bringing his message of hope and resilience to an even wider audience. He continued to write, speak, and advocate for children in need, his work touching lives across the globe. And though his life was filled with achievements, it was the quiet moments that meant the most. Sitting by the fire with the Carters, visiting the children at St. Mary's, and receiving letters from those whose lives had been changed by his story. For Oliver, the boy who once sent a letter to Santa and dared to believe, the greatest gift was knowing that hope, when shared, could light up even the darkest corners of the world. The years unfolded with a steady rhythm, each one bringing new milestones and memories for Oliver. As his work expanded and his foundation grew, Oliver remained grounded, always carrying the lessons of his past with him. He had learned that the smallest acts of kindness, like writing a letter or answering one, could ripple out in ways he'd never imagined. By his early 30s, Oliver had become an international figure, known not just for his books but for his tireless advocacy for children in need. The Letter to Hope Foundation had chapters in multiple countries, each one tailored to meet the unique challenges faced by children in different communities. His annual events at St. Mary's Orphanage were now replicated in orphanages and foster homes worldwide, bringing joy and hope to thousands of children every year. But amidst the whirlwind of travel, speeches, and projects, Oliver always made time for the people and places that mattered most. St. Mary's remained a second home to him, and he often spent quiet afternoons there, reading stories to the children or helping them write their own letters. One such afternoon, a little boy named Samuel tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. Carter," he said, holding up a crumpled piece of paper, "can you help me write my letter to Santa?" Oliver smiled and knelt down beside him. "Of course, Samuel. What do you want to say?" Samuel hesitated, chewing on his lip. "I don't really want toys or anything. I want to find my sister. She's in another foster home and I miss her." Oliver's heart ached at the boy's words, but he kept his voice steady. "That's a very special wish, Samuel. Let's write it down and see what we can do." As they worked on the letter together, Oliver made a silent vow to do everything in his power to reunite Samuel with his sister. He knew all too well the pain of being separated from family, and he wanted to ensure that Samuel wouldn't have to endure it any longer. In the weeks that followed, Oliver reached out to social workers, foster agencies, and the local government, using every connection he had to track down Samuel's sister. It was a challenging process, filled with red tape and delays, but Oliver refused to give up. Finally, on a crisp autumn day, he received the news he had been hoping for. Samuel's sister had been located, and arrangements were being made to bring them back together. Oliver immediately drove to St. Mary's to share the news. When he told Samuel, the boy's face lit up with pure, unfiltered joy. "Really? I'm going to see her again?" "Yes, Samuel," Oliver said, his voice thick with emotion. "You'll be together again soon." Samuel threw his arms around Oliver's neck, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. Thank you." The reunion took place a few weeks later in the main hall of St. Mary's. The staff and children gathered to witness the moment, their faces filled with anticipation. When Samuel's sister, a shy but radiant 10-year-old named Lucy, walked through the door, Samuel ran to her without hesitation, throwing his arms around her. The room erupted into applause, and Oliver stood off to the side, his heart full. Moments like this were why he did what he did, why he had dedicated his life to turning hope into action. As Oliver continued his work, his story became a source of inspiration not just for children but for people of all ages. Letters poured in from readers and supporters, sharing how his journey had touched their lives. One letter, in particular, stood out to him. It was from a woman named Grace, who had been a child at St. Mary's during the Christmas when the Carters first arrived. "Dear Oliver," she wrote, "I don't know if you remember me, but I was there the year everything changed. You probably don't realize it, but your letter to Santa didn't just save you. It saved all of us. You gave us hope when we thought there was none. Thank you for believing, not just for yourself but for all of us." Oliver read the letter several times, each word sinking deep into his heart. Grace's words reminded him of the ripple effect of hope, how one act of belief could spread far beyond what he ever imagined. In his 40s, Oliver decided to take a step back from the public eye to focus on writing and mentoring. He purchased a small cottage near St. Mary's, where he could be close to the place that had shaped his life. The cottage became a sanctuary, filled with books, journals, and the laughter of children who visited regularly. One Christmas Eve, as he sat by the fire with a cup of tea, a knock came at the door. When he opened it, he found a group of children from St. Mary's, holding letters in their hands. "Mr. Carter," one of them said shyly, "we wanted to give you our letters to Santa. You always know what to do with them." Oliver chuckled, his heart swelling. "Come in, everyone. Let's read them together." They spent the evening by the fire, reading the letters and talking about their hopes and dreams. As Oliver listened to their stories, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. These children, with their unshakable belief in the magic of possibility, were a testament to everything he had worked for. Years later, when Oliver's time came to an end, his legacy lived on in the countless lives he had touched. The Letter to Hope Foundation continued its work, led by a new generation inspired by his vision. At St. Mary's, a plaque was installed in his honor, reading, "In memory of Oliver Carter, whose belief in hope and kindness changed the world. May we all carry his light forward." But Oliver's true legacy wasn't in the books he wrote or the programs he started. It was in the smiles of children who believed again, the families reunited, and the letters sent out into the world, carrying dreams and wishes into the hands of those who cared. And somewhere, in a quiet corner of the world, a little boy's letter to Santa still sat framed on a mantle, a reminder of the moment when everything began. The legacy of Oliver Carter was not just a tale whispered in orphanages or read in books. It became a symbol of enduring hope and the boundless potential of kindness. Long after Oliver's time, the world continued to be shaped by his vision and the lives he had touched. The Letter to Hope Foundation thrived under new leadership, expanding its reach to dozens of countries. One of its most notable projects was the Letters Across Generations program, which paired children in need with mentors and pen pals from all walks of life. Inspired by Oliver's story, the program created bridges between generations, uniting people through the simple yet powerful act of writing letters. At the heart of this program was a museum dedicated to Oliver's life and work. Located near St. Mary's Orphanage, the museum displayed his journals, letters, and artifacts from his childhood. Visitors walked through its halls, reading the words that had sparked a movement, often moved to tears by the sheer impact of one boy's belief in something greater than himself. In one corner of the museum sat the framed letter Oliver had written to Santa so many years ago. Children stopped to stare at it, their eyes wide with wonder as they read the words of the boy who had dared to dream of a family. Each year, on Christmas Eve, the foundation hosted a massive celebration at St. Mary's Orphanage, now a sprawling campus that served as both a home and a beacon of hope. Families, children, and supporters from around the world gathered to honor Oliver's memory and celebrate the magic of the season. This particular year, the event had a special guest, Samuel, now an adult and a prominent leader within the foundation. His reunion with his sister, Lucy, had been one of Oliver's proudest moments, and now Samuel carried on the mission with the same passion and dedication. As Samuel took the stage, the crowd fell silent. He looked out at the sea of faces, his voice steady as he began to speak. "I was just a boy when I met Oliver Carter," he said. "At the time, I didn't understand how much he would change my life. But Oliver taught me something I'll never forget, that hope isn't just a wish. It's a choice. It's something we carry in our hearts and pass on to others." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. Oliver's story didn't end when he left us. It lives on in every child who writes a letter, in every family reunited, and in every act of kindness inspired by his belief in the power of hope. The audience erupted into applause, their faces glowing with the warmth of shared purpose. Months later, while sorting through old records at the Foundation's archive, a volunteer stumbled upon a forgotten box labeled simply Owen Carter. Inside were several journals Oliver had kept in his later years, filled with reflections, sketches, and letters he had never sent. One entry, dated just a year before his passing, read, "Hope is a flame we must nurture, even when the world feels cold. It's not just for ourselves but for those who come after us, those who might need to borrow our light until they find their own. If my life has been a matchstick in the darkness, then I hope it has sparked enough flames to keep the world warm." The discovery of the journals reignited interest in Oliver's story, sparking new projects and initiatives inspired by his words. A special edition of his collected works, titled A Light in the Darkness, The Writings of Oliver Carter, became a bestseller, spreading his message to a new generation. St. Mary's Orphanage, once a place of struggle and sorrow, had transformed into a thriving community center. It offered education, counseling, and creative programs for children and families alike. A new building on the campus was dedicated to foster care advocacy, providing resources and support for families looking to adopt or reunite. On the 50th anniversary of Oliver's famous letter to Santa, the children at St. Mary's organized a special tribute. They wrote their own letters, not just to Santa, but to Oliver himself, thanking him for his enduring impact on their lives. One letter, from a 10-year-old girl named Amelia, read, "Dear Oliver, I never met you, but I feel like I know you. Your story gives me courage when I feel scared, and your words remind me to keep believing. Thank you for showing the world that even small people can make a big difference. I hope I can be like you someday. Love, Amelia." The letters were collected and placed in a time capsule to be buried on the grounds of St. Mary's, a gift for future generations to discover. Despite the grandeur of his public legacy, it was the quieter, personal stories that truly defined Oliver's impact. People often spoke of how his books had guided them through difficult times, how his foundation had given them hope, and how his unshakable belief in kindness had inspired them to be better. One such story came from Grace, the girl who had written to Oliver years before. Now a successful social worker, she often told her clients about the boy who had once written to Santa and changed the world. "Oliver taught me that hope isn't just a feeling," she would say. "It's an action. It's something we create for ourselves and for others." Decades after Oliver's passing, on what would have been his 80th birthday, a statue was unveiled in the town square near St. Mary's. The bronze sculpture depicted Oliver as a young boy, sitting on a bench with a letter in his hand, gazing up at the sky with a look of quiet determination. At the base of the statue were the words that had come to define his life. "Family isn't where you come from. It's who you choose to share your life with. Hope is the gift we give to each other, and kindness is the legacy we leave behind." The unveiling ceremony drew thousands of people, young and old, from all corners of the world. As the crowd stood in silent reflection, a single snowflake drifted down, landing gently on the letter in Oliver's hand. And so, the boy who once sent a letter to Santa became a symbol of everything good in the world, a reminder that hope, no matter how small, can ignite a flame that burns brightly for generations. His story, woven into the hearts of countless people, continued to inspire long after the last page had been turned. The light Oliver Carter sparked never dimmed. It lived on, carried by those who believed in the power of kindness, the strength of love, and the magic of hope.